From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about President Joe Biden's recent trip to the Middle East on July 13th through 16th, with stops in Israel and Saudi Arabia. The president met with a host of key regional leaders, including those from Israel, Palestine, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and the Gulf states. The trip came against a backdrop of regional and global political and economic upheaval amid the ongoing Russian war on Ukraine, a broader realignment of key regional actors, and growing concerns over energy prices, inflation, and food security. Today's program will be divided up into 4 segments, each with a different MEI scholar, to provide a variety of perspectives on the key issues of what the president set out to achieve, how successful the trip was, and the implications for U.S. policy going forward. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. First up on the program, I'll be speaking with Paul Salem, MEI's president. Paul, welcome back to the program, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Alistair, and welcome to our listeners.
Paul, President Biden has been facing a number of challenges at home and abroad, including high energy prices, inflation, the war in Ukraine, strategic competition with Russia and China, and growing global food security concerns, to name but a few. Given that complex problem set, what were the main items on his agenda as he traveled to the region, and what were your expectations for the trip?
Well, the reason for the visit to the region was driven by some of the things you mentioned. And many of the things you mentioned were driven or triggered by the Russian war in Ukraine itself, which then, led to a spike in energy prices, certainly impacted Europe very strongly. And while the U.S. thought that because it's a net energy producer, it would be shielded from global energy prices, it was a rude awakening, as it were, that it's definitely not. And gas prices at the pump reached $5 a barrel, which hit President Biden and the administration where it hurts, meaning domestic electoral politics in an election year. So that is really one of the main reasons why Biden realized he had to go out to the region. He could not avoid that any longer. And while out there, work on other issues, many of which you mentioned, food security, countering Russia and China, and many other things that I'm sure we'll talk about. But I do think the war on Ukraine and the impact it had on energy was, if anything, the one thing that drove the visit.
Paul, all this comes at a time of real change for the Middle East amid widespread perceptions of U.S. withdrawal or disengagement, and as Middle Eastern actors are realigning regionally and diversifying their relations with global powers. How did that context affect things going in and shape what was possible for the president to achieve?
Interestingly, I think, both sides in maybe previous years began to feel that maybe they could live without each other. Certainly the U.S., since maybe the Obama administration was trying to pivot away from the Middle East, that the U.S. had spent too much treasure and blood in the Middle East for no real gain, and that the long-term challenge anyway was China. So the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration had no eagerness to increase their involvement in the Middle East. But every administration realized there are too many interests that the U.S. has in the Middle East to walk away from. Some of that is energy, some of that is general economics, the amount of investment and trade that goes both ways, the primacy of the U.S. dollar globally, which has a lot to do with Saudi Arabia and in what currency it sells its oil to China and to Asia. Also, countering China and Russia needs to partly be done in regions around the world, and one of the strategic regions is the Middle East. The Everlast boat that was stuck in the Suez Canal reminded the U.S. that trade routes matter, that they need to remain open for obvious economic reasons. So the U.S. thought that maybe it could, do without great engagement in the region, but I think the administration realized, nope, they do need serious engagement. I think countries in the region have certainly grown in capacity. This is not the Middle East of 40 or 50 years ago. You can see that in the GDPs of various countries, not only Israel, but Saudi Arabia, Turkey, even Iran and Egypt and some others. They've really developed over the past decades. Saudi Arabia is one of 3 major energy producers in the world. The other 2 are the US and Russia. So when Russia goes partly offline, Saudi Arabia is going to increase dramatically in importance. And while Saudi Arabia, considers flirting now and again with Russia or China, Saudi Arabia is very much aware that really there isn't any other strategic partner for it other than the United States. So both sides realize that despite their differences, despite bad things in the marriage sometimes, they need each other and they better sit down and talk with each other. Of course, U.S.-Israeli relations are long-standing and so on, but that's a kind of a quick answer there.
What were your main takeaways from the trip? What did Biden accomplish, and how effective do you think it was?
I think it was moderately effective. It wasn't a great success. Partly there were no breakthroughs to be had. On the energy side, although a lot of this was driven by energy, there's limited capacity in Saudi Arabia or Saudi Arabia and the UAE and some of the other smaller producers. There is a bit of excess capacity, but not much more than maybe in the next year or two, 2 million barrels a day extra capacity to take Saudi Arabia up to 13 million barrels a day. But the world consumes 100 million barrels a day, and Iran is largely offline, might remain so. Russia is under sanctions. Meanwhile, the world's thirst for energy, despite the energy transition, and the world's thirst for hydrocarbons, unfortunately, is high and is growing. So there is no real breakthrough to be had in the Gulf to turn around energy prices on a dime. Secondly, the other hoped for some breakthrough between Israel and Saudi Arabia, for them to sign along, like the UAE and Bahrain did, sign on to the Abraham Accords and normalize with Israel. It was well known that Saudi Arabia was not ready for that step, and that Saudi Arabia would require from Israel some major concession to the Palestinians before it could do that. And Israel is either not willing and has not been willing to do that, or certainly is in the middle of a governing crisis and doesn't even have the capacity to consider that for the time being. So there were no major breakthroughs expected. So the success, I would say, was a return to or a progress towards business. I wouldn't call it business as usual, business as necessary. That the US and these regional partners, they have common interests, they need each other, they need to work together on a whole bunch of issues. You just tick off a number. We've mentioned energy, that's oil and gas, there's energy transition. The Middle East is very important in other forms of energy and wants to be a player in solar and wind and new technologies that might be used. We've mentioned the economic and US dollar issues. Counterterrorism remains a big common concern. ISIS is still very alive and well. Countering Iran is a common interest and a common concern, particularly at a time when it's not clear if the Biden administration is going to get a return to the nuclear deal or not. I was very pleased to see that there was a lot of progress made on addressing food insecurity issues in the wider Middle East region, which is really a very serious issue for tens of millions of people in the region. There was also some investment and talk about necessary infrastructure cooperation between the countries in the region and the West in general to answer to infrastructure needs, and also to provide a bit of an alternative to the Chinese One Road, One Belt initiative. Along that line as well, there was agreements to explore 5G and 6G communications technology, which has been a sticking point at a time when China is offering Huawei 5G technology. So I think I wouldn't necessarily call it a return. Relations haven't completely been ruptured, but I think it's good that relations have been resumed at the highest levels between the U.S. leader and leaders of key countries in the region.
Building on that, what do you see as the implications for U.S. policy moving forward coming out of the trip?
I think it's important for both parties to pursue these interests and policy developments, policy discussions on these 6 or 7 avenues that I talked about. But it's also the case that this visit did not create any magic wands or any breakthroughs. The challenges that the region and the world are facing remain high. That is an energy challenge, which is bad and probably going to get worse over the next couple of years, not only because of Russia and Ukraine, although that's a big part of it, but also because in the energy transition, the supply of energy is basically not keeping up with the demand for energy. That will cause high energy prices. That might also encourage a global recession, which maybe might already be happening, but if there's high energy prices as well, it might make global economics challenging. Food security, very important regional and global issue. There's been good news today, unrelated to Biden's visit to the region, but related to Erdogan's visit to Tehran, that maybe there is a deal on getting Ukrainian wheat out to global markets. That's very important. It was talked about by Biden and the leaders of the region. On Iran, the challenge remains. The fate of the nuclear deal remains unknown. Countering Iran remains not a simple matter. So I would say it was an important visit, but the challenges, as well as some opportunities, and some of the social sectors that I mentioned to help people in need and vulnerable communities, there was a lot of investment and aid and modes of cooperation agreed in the visits there. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I'll describe the visit as a working visit, let's call it that, and getting to work is what needs to be done.
Paul, Russian President Vladimir Putin also traveled to the Middle East shortly after President Biden, meeting with Iranian and Turkish leaders in Tehran in what seemed like a sort of response to Biden's visit. What stood out to you about his trip, and were there any sort of interesting contrasts or parallels between the two?
Yeah, I definitely think it was Russian President Putin's answer to Biden's visit to the region. I mean, as we said, maybe Biden's visit wasn't a smashing success, didn't have any major breakthroughs, wasn't necessarily a game changer. But Putin's visit to Tehran also was not, did not resonate, was not a major achievement in itself. First of all, I mean, Tehran is a very isolated country going through its own very difficult economic conditions and isolation. So it doesn't provide Putin with any great outlet onto the world or onto the region. Iran definitely has a number of, powerful militias in the Middle East, but with most countries in the Middle East, has very difficult, contentious relations and is in proxy conflict in some. And as Putin visits Tehran, he certainly would lose points in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, partners that he wanted to maintain very good relations with. And I think it also underscores the degree to which Russia indeed is isolated. I mean, if that's the main country in the wider Middle East that is allied with Russia, you might also add the miserable state of Assad Syria and the Assad regime in Syria. If those are your main allies, it also indicates sort of a limitation of Russia's reach. Also, the relationship. I mean, for the head of Russia, previously the Soviet Union, to go to Iran for military technology, basically drone technology, is is quite a turnaround. And for him also to meet President Erdogan and to have Turkish drones decimating Russian troops in Ukraine, it's a far cry from where the Soviet Union was, a far cry from where President Putin just a few months ago projected an image of great power and capacity and technological prowess and demonstrating his military capacities in Syria. It's a very chastened, very different Russia that appears in Tehran looking for drone technology, looking to learn from Iran how to evade sanctions, how to smuggle oil. I mean, it's really not a victory lap at all to my view. And yet, obviously Russia is present. Iran has a presence, so it cannot be ignored.
Indeed, the optics of that video of Putin pacing back and forth on the carpet waiting for Erdogan was quite a striking image, I think, and kind of sums it all up very, very nicely.
Yes. The big man is looking smaller, as it were.
Indeed. We've covered a lot of ground in our conversation, but before we wrap up, any final thoughts, Paul?
Well, I would say, we're focused on the visits of these two, great power leaders to the region. The region certainly feels its leverage. Hydrocarbons are important again. Turkey is in a strategic geopolitical location on the Black Sea, and Erdogan has really leveraged his, having one foot in NATO and one foot in Moscow has enabled him to pull off a deal on wheat, which is a globally critically important thing. That's a victory for him. Iran finds itself also, great powers, like Moscow visiting it for help. It's feeling its oats as well. But, before concluding, it's important to say that the region itself is still in extreme disarray. The region's leaders, while, leveraging their influence vis-a-vis the US or vis-a-vis Russia, need to also look at putting their own house in order. The Middle East remains an extremely disordered place. And the more the region's leaders can work with each other to end wars in Yemen and Syria, to stabilize Iraq and Lebanon, to do more for food security for the poor of the region, they should pay a lot of attention to that as well. But thanks for having me on, Alistair, and regards to all of our listeners.
Thank you very much for joining the program, Paul. Appreciate it. Next up on the program, I'll be speaking with Bilal Saab, Senior Fellow and Director of MEI's Defense and Security Program. He's also the author of the recently published book, Rebuilding Arab Defense, U.S. Security Cooperation in the Middle East. Bilal, thanks for joining us and welcome back to the program.
Always good to be with you, my friend.
So there's been a lot of confusion about what Biden's trip to the region was meant to accomplish, in no small part due to the, frankly, rather muddled messaging coming from the White House. Let's try to clear things up. What, in your view, was the president trying to achieve on this trip?
That's a tough question. And you're right, there was some confusion. And I think the strategic messaging was, let's just describe it as subpar. If you ask me, I think the main objective of the president's trip to the Middle East was to signal to both partners and adversaries that the United States was serious about restoring its strategic position in the region, which, as you know, Alistair, has taken some considerable hits in recent years. So I just don't buy the argument or the conventional wisdom that the visit really was meant to secure some immediate agreements or firm agreements from the Saudis and the Emiratis on increased oil production. And don't get me wrong, obviously this would have been a very invaluable outcome had it happened. But I don't think that was really the intent of the trip. I think the president himself, despite the poor messaging, did publish an opinion piece in the Washington Post, at least trying to explain and provide a little bit more clarity as to why he was headed to the region. And in there, I'll give him credit. He did rightly put the trip in its proper strategic context. This wasn't about the Saudis. This wasn't about the Emiratis, despite the title of the Washington Post, which frankly did not do him any favors. This should have been more about why I'm going to the region as opposed to why I'm going to Saudi Arabia. But anyway, so this wasn't about the Saudis. It wasn't about the Emiratis. It wasn't about the Israelis. It wasn't about anybody else. This was about us, first and foremost, and our standing in a region that has proven yet again its strategic importance to world security, world commerce, and specifically to U.S. long-term interests across the globe.
Looking at the outcomes, how did they stack up against that? What do you think the trip accomplished?
Well, I think it's too soon to tell, Alistair. There'll be follow-ups, I'm sure, at least I hope, but they'll be mostly on a bilateral level. Right. And those, I think, will give us a better picture in terms of what the trip will accomplish. I think the reaction from the region to the trip, not that I've been tracking every single reaction from every country, but mostly it was positive. Now let's just see what specific agreements they come up with the administration, what sort of more periodic engagements are set up to capitalize on the trip and to get to some deliverables.
What do you think the implications will be for U.S. policy moving forward? And what will you be watching out for to see how successful this is over time?
Yeah, so this has been a subtle process. And I think the trip is just another step in this process, which I'm about to describe to you. So the implications is that we're actually starting to come around a certain consensus in Washington. And I think it's a bipartisan consensus that the Middle East still matters strategically, and that the only way we're going to preserve our long-term interests there is through a serious commitment to real partnership with these countries, and on multiple levels, not just on defense and security, but also on energy, economics, investment, the environment, food security, climate change, you name it. Respect for a rules-based order where aggression, especially the kind that we're seeing in Ukraine, will not be tolerated and will be collectively confronted. So if you think about it, for the first time since we started our engagement in the Middle East in the mid-20th century, our strategy now, and I'm going to use that word strategy, is to integrate with our partners and amongst themselves to the extent that we can, of course, because this is an incredibly challenging mission, in order to pursue our evolving foreign policy objectives. That, I think, is the biggest implication of the trip. It's just to signal, to message that the only way we're going to do this and address these common challenges is by doing it together. And yeah, there's nothing novel about it. I mean, that's exactly what we tell the Europeans, what we tell the Asians. But now we're telling it to the Middle Eastern partners. This is sort of like new language to them, but universally, that's precisely what the United States does across the globe. Now we're going to try to implement it in the Middle East. And of course, it's going to take some time.
I wanted to drill down into what's known as the regional security framework in a little bit more detail and get your kind of thoughts on that and what it involves and what the pathway to implementation and regional integration looks like.
Right. So I don't know how out there that concept is of regional security framework. This is the term that CENTCOM has come up with, sort of to capitalize on the objectives set up by the administration to seek higher levels of integration with these partners. So thank God, gone is the concept of MESA, if you remember, Alistair, in the Middle East Strategic Alliance. And now in its place is this, what I believe, a more realistic, a more serious, a more gradual concept, which is called the Regional Security Framework. And it's got a bunch of pillars, none of which are really brand new, but it's a matter of really how we are approaching them and how we're going to execute them, as you said yourself. The pillars are, integrated air missile defense, right, which is a huge pillar. I think it comes first. Maritime security, crisis response, especially in light of the previous attacks, in terms of coming up with an agreement in terms of how we're going to respond to those collectively. Special operations forces, and theater sustainment and fires. And in terms of execution of these, every single one of those is going to have a procedural, technical, and an integration phase. The procedural part, which is the more immediate one, is to just make sure that all the participants really have a good, clear, uniform understanding of the threat environment, right? So we all have a common baseline on what the threats are. The technical part is easier to sort of digest, and it's more of a medium term. It's essentially to achieve and maintain interoperability, right? So that our weapon systems are actually matching, and so it becomes easier to actually engage in coalition warfare. The long-term integration part is to establish interconnected systems across domains and as well as secure communications. So you can imagine, Alistair, a lot of this is going to require an enormous amount of work and cooperation. And we're going to have to beef up our training, our exercises, purchasing the right kind of equipment, the necessary kind of equipment, coming up with authorities, coming up with the joint doctrines. It really is a very heavy lift. But we got to be transparent. That's precisely what's needed to reach at least a measure of military integration with at least some, perhaps not all, of our key regional partners. And engagement is going to be at the forefront of all this, consistent engagement, which is why CENTCOM, in addition to its bilateral engagements with all these countries, has recently come up with two regional conferences, one happening every 3 months at the 2-star level. So that's going to be the one sort of that is, I think, going to have a more practical implementation set of responsibilities. And then there's one that's a little bit more strategic, happening every 6 months at the 4-star level with what we call the CHODs, the Chiefs of Defense. And that's going to be those from the Gulf Cooperation Council, so all 6 nations, plus 3, which is Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq. So, the promising thing about it is that CENTCOM is patiently and methodically laying the groundwork for all this. Of course, now it comes down to some support, some enabling from the administration. And that's precisely what gets us back to the trip, to sort of as a first step in this long journey of achieving some level of integration with these partners.
Bilal, this is far from the first U.S. effort to promote regional security cooperation, and kind of mindful of what has and hasn't worked in the past. What are the key lessons to keep in mind as we move forward with what is, as you said, admittedly a pretty complex and long-term effort?
Right. And that's a good question, Alistair. I think the key lessons are, first, there's no one size fits all. Each country is going to have its own political and administrative constraints, physical, bureaucratic capacities, foreign policy tendencies, habits and norms. So we're going to have to be very sensitive to all those things, which, let's be candid about it, it's something that we've never been really good at, right? We have our FAOs, we have our foreign area officers in the region, we have our embassies to try to understand the particulars of each and every single country that we deal with, but we still, historically speaking, have a poor understanding really of a lot of these things that what we call, particulars of every partner that we deal with. Lesson number 2 that I could think of, I think, is that no matter how unique the country, which is sort of like contradictory to what I just said, but no matter how unique the country is, at the end of the day, there are certain universal principles in defense that you have to respect and you have to abide by no matter what in order to generate effective combat power. And the challenge for us is going to be, and for them too, is to marry the particulars of the country, the distinctive features of the country, with those general principles of military effectiveness. And some of those principles, of course, would include, the empowerment of junior officers, the commitment to training, the professionalization of the military, the rewarding of, the ambitious officers and punishing the underachievers, unity of command and control, centralize when you have to centralize, decentralize when you have to decentralize, conducting threat-based analyses, committing to the extent possible to some healthy civil-military relations where the civilian leadership, is the one setting overarching strategy and providing strategic direction, and then the military is the one that executes, and so on and so forth. I don't care what the particulars of the country are. If you don't have those things, it is very unlikely that you're going to be a militarily effective, partner, which makes that partner far less attractive to us. And then the final lesson I would say is that, all of this requires consistent engagement on our part. It doesn't have to be tens of thousands of troops, maybe hundreds, dozens even, who are just performing the right set of duties and responsibilities to help the partner develop the necessary capacities to not only generate, but also sustain combat power. You have to remember that at the end of the day, we're not helping these partners to become stronger militarily just so they can go on their own and fight their own battles, real or imaginary. We're doing all this and we're improving security cooperation so that they can actually fight with us, in ways like they've never done that before. Not even in Operation Inherent Resolve, the latest coalition operations against the Islamic State, like very minimal contributions from them. And we need better than that. We need better than that because we have new foreign policy priorities across the globe when we have fewer resources that we are deploying to the Middle East. So what we're essentially looking for is a strategically interdependent partner. And of course, technically interoperable too. We're not necessarily looking for an independent partner that just go on its own and fight its own wars that may not be actually, beneficial to our interests. So those are some of the key lessons that I can think of, Alistair.
Great. Thanks, Bilal. Before we wrap up, any final thoughts?
I know that the president has gotten a lot of flack for the trip, okay, but I'd like to give him some credit. He knew that meeting with the Saudi leadership was going to cost him politically at home and possibly upset some senior members of his own administration. But he went there and he understood that we were essentially, and it sounds like I'm exaggerating, Alistair, but I'm not. He understood that we were losing the Middle East. We were losing our partners. And that, in many ways, was just not going to help us with the strategic competition with Russia and China. And so you got to give him credit. He took a political hit. It might be quite pricey down the road. It might just, cost him re-election. Who knows? But he did the right thing strategically speaking. He did the right thing by preserving some very important national interests of the country, despite the unpopular decision that he made and the politically costly decision that he made. So give Biden some credit.
That's all we have time for today, but thank you very much for joining the program once again, Bilal.
Always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Alistair.
Next up on the program, I'll be speaking with Mirette Mabrouk, Senior Fellow and Director of MEI's Egypt Program. Mirette, welcome back to the program, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's dive right in. A great deal has been written about what President Biden was aiming to achieve on this trip, including by Biden himself in an op-ed to the Washington Post, but I want to get your take on things. What were your expectations for Biden's visit, and how effective do you think the trip was?
I'm not sure I had that many expectations for the visit, really, at the risk of sounding slightly negative, basically because I think it was it was a situation where the US felt that their presence in the region, a state presence in the region, was long overdue because of the perception that, because of the fact that the US had been steadily withdrawing from the region for quite a while. And I do think that one of the big wake-up calls to that was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the US, along with the West, expected its regional allies to jump up and toe the line. And they didn't. And the fact that they didn't, I think, is deeply indicative of many things, among them the US position, and the fact that there really are no more huge superpowers that can dictate in the manner that they've been used to dictating, and the fact that other countries are going to have to do what they feel is in their interests. Now, on the one hand, President Biden had been fairly clear that one of his objectives was Israeli security. In fact, I think he mentioned before he left that one of the things that he wanted to do was stop the senseless wars between the Arabs and Israel. Despite the fact that the possibility for any senseless war between the Arabs and Israel was effectively put to rest in 1978 when Egypt made peace with Israel. But still, but he did go and he did emphasize the importance of Israel's security. And also, it was also very, very clear that despite the official US position that there's still an interest in a two-state solution, the really restarting the Israeli-Palestinian peace process isn't actually a priority at the moment. Apart from helping the Palestinians, there's very little else that the US is going to do for the moment. There was an interest in expanding regional security and economic cooperation and integrating Israel into that. And I think there has been limited success. There has been limited success with that, at the very least. The US had been helping mediate on the transfer of two Red Sea islands from Egypt to Saudi Arabia, Tiran and Senafir. And because of the Camp David Accords, Israeli approval was required on the removal of multinational forces overseas. And that has happened. And as a result, the Saudi Arabians have allowed Israeli flights in their airspace, which is new and is a win for President Biden. But other than that, the other things, what's being referred to as an Arab NATO, those are going to be significantly more difficult to bring along. But we'll get into that later. I don't want to keep talking.
How was the trip perceived in Egypt?
Okay, so you have two things. You have the public perception and what's being trumpeted in newspapers and stuff, which is it was a great thing. The U.S. president met the Egyptian president. It's an affirmation of U.S.-Egyptian ties. But you have to remember that the U.S. is Egypt's second largest trading partner. The two countries do over $9 billion. Last year did over $9 billion worth of trade two-way, mostly in the US's favor. But I understand that I think in the US there was a feeling that the Egyptian presidency desperately wanted this meeting, and it's not quite true. It's the sort of thing that is, it was lovely that it happened, but I think that both parties have been aware for some time that the relationship is sort of pleasantly and sometimes efficiently, sometimes not, but hopefully efficiently transactional, and that there are differences. There will always be differences, but pragmatically speaking, it is not a relationship that anyone wants to lose. So I think there was agreement on some things, mostly on trade, mostly on energy, mostly on clean trade. The resumption, it had started last year after an absence of 6 years of US strategic dialogue. So I think it's a continuation of what is generally and occasionally problematic, but generally fairly efficient relationship.
Looking ahead, what do you see as the kind of implications coming out of the trip and out of Biden's meeting with President Sisi for U.S. policy toward Egypt and this sort of broader U.S.-Egyptian relationship?
There are a few things to bear in mind in the context of this whole meeting. There's a lot going on. I think when President Biden landed in the region, it's a different region from the one that he, I think, last met, and I think it's a region that I think that the U.S. is only just starting to recalibrate its understanding of, if you like, because things have changed. There are new geostrategic alliances. There is much jockeying for international power. I mean, specifically, I think the Saudi Arabians are really trying to step forward and present themselves as, if you like, the fulcrum for regional cooperation with the United States and, the prime regional power player, which is a position that it is jockeying for with the UAE. Position once held by Egypt, but is really now you have these two other states vying for that. The other thing, of course, is the dependence on or the relationship with the US. I think it's been a while since the region thought that the US was going to provide the kind of support that they had originally counted on it for, that they had traditionally counted on it for. I think the Saudi Arabians, and the Emiratis were upset at the US not stepping up with the Yemeni attacks and missiles. And I think there is just the idea in the region that we are going to have to do more of this for ourselves, and we are going to have to recraft the landscape to one that suits us better. And I think the US is starting to realize that. The only thing is, President Biden specifically said, we are not going to step back and leave a vacuum that is going to be filled by Russia and China. I'm not sure that boat hasn't already sailed, but I think there's, I'm sure someone is drilling into this, but I think there's also the feeling, I think that you want to bear in mind that Russia and China are not synonymous. They're two different countries with different modus operandi and different designs in the region. Russia has extremely long-standing and deeply rooted relations in the region. But they're also, they're geopolitical, but also military. I mean, it was a huge arms dealer, and military conflict in the region has been advantageous to Russia, which has often stepped in and made use of it for its own purposes. China is more interested in the financial side of things. I mean, huge gobs of political instability and military fractiousness are not particularly useful for China. So they're two different animals and probably need to be handled differently because their relationships with the countries in the region are different. But they are there, and if the US wants back in, then it's going to have to bear that in mind. It also wants to bear in mind that the kind of cooperation that it is looking at, in particular, military cooperation, what's sort of being referred to as the Arab NATO, different countries in that, if it comes about organization, are going to want different things. The Gulf countries have an Iran focus, and they share that with the US and Israel. Egypt and Jordan, for example, are not as worried about Iran. I mean, Jordan, may be worried about refugee camps in Syria, and Egypt's worry about Iran comes through Hamas, but it feels that it can control Hamas. So it isn't. Neither of them are as worried about Iran, and neither of them are going to get sucked into any military conflicts with Iran. At the moment, things are going all right because I think at least the Egyptians have said, well, we're all right with cooperation and coordination, but not synchronization, which is important. So I think it's important to understand that this is not one big hegemonic lump. The states in this alliance, if you like, they have different needs, and the US is going to have to find the part in the Venn diagram where all those needs intersect.
I think that's an excellent point, and kind of points to exactly how tricky this dynamic is going to be to kind of finesse going forward. I think we've covered a large swath of territory here, but any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think it was a good. I mean, it was a necessary visit. All right. I mean, you can't really have expected that much out of it because it's been a while, but it was a necessary visit. It was a good move to start off with, but I think it depends. It depends on how the US chooses and how the other countries, how everyone chooses to handle those relationships going forward, and what the focus of the alliances are going to be.
That's all we have time for today, but thank you very much for joining the program, Mirette.
Thank you for having me.
Next up on the program, I'll be speaking with Alex Vatanka, director of MEI's Iran program and senior fellow with the Frontier Europe Initiative. He's also the author of, most recently, the 2021 book, The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran, the United States, Foreign Policy, and Political Rivalry since 1979. Alex, thank you for joining us and welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Alistair.
Alex, let's dive right in. What, in your view, was President Biden trying to achieve during his recent Middle East trip when it comes to Iran?
To be honest, it didn't seem like Iran was on the top of his list. I think that was the impression that I got by looking at U.S. media sitting here in Washington. But that was also my impression just reviewing the Iranian reaction to Biden's trip. Iran was somewhere on the list, but it was almost a secondary, factor, which was a surprise. I think there was an agreement, more or less, both here in Washington and Tehran, that President Biden's visit to the Middle East was really about trying to push forward the sort of nascent attempts by Israel and Saudi Arabia to move in the direction of diplomatic recognition of one another. So basically, to sort of continue what the Trump administration did with the bringing about the Abraham Accords of 2020, that seemed to have been the reading in terms of what the key objective of President Biden's visit was. Now, I know, other issues were mentioned, oil production by the Saudis to bring the price of oil down. Iran was mentioned. What to do with Russia was mentioned, and all the rest of it. But if you put everything next to each other, I think this sort of on balance, it was the Israel-Saudi relationship that really seemed to have been the driver behind the visit.
Looking at what came out of the trip, what did it accomplish, and how successful do you think it was?
Look, I mean, it's still early days in terms of practical new realities that have been, born out of the trip. The trip happened just about a week ago or so we need to give it some time. Symbolically, I think the most significant, two most significant factors for me were the Biden administration has now resumed at the highest level the conversation with the Saudis. The last few years of the Biden administration, where the Saudis were complaining that they were being put aside, the pressure was on the Biden White House to sort of essentially punish Saudi Arabia for the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But the trip by Biden has essentially started, it seems to me at least, if not a new chapter, then at least a new effort to get this conversation back on tracks again. This is a relationship that's important for various reasons. The increase in the price of oil might have been a factor, but I think essentially this visit or other efforts to bring about the resumption of that strategic level dialogue was bound to happen anyways. So that was certainly one factor. And the other one, as I said earlier, symbolically important is the sort of, the flight from Israel to Saudi Arabia. it was more than just symbolic. It sort of shows that perhaps with the right American commitment and regional receptiveness, there can be a new integrated Middle East, where countries that a few years ago were considering each other as arch rivals can move in a different direction. Saudi Arabia, for the longest time, has, and to this day, continues to refuse to recognize Israel until the Palestinian issue has been resolved in a way that's acceptable to the Palestinians and the general Arab public opinion. But the fact that they were opening up their airspace, the fact that they're allowing for low-level Israeli presence on Saudi soil, all these things are, at least in my book, a positive developments. And President Biden is pushing this agenda forward. And again, with the right leadership, this actually could result in new positive realities for the Middle East.
Looking slightly longer term, what do you think the implications of all this are for U.S. policy on Iran specifically?
I mean, the Iranians, by and large, had no sense of panic about President Biden's visit. I took it to mean that Iran didn't think the president really had a whole new initiative in his sleeves that he was going to unveil during his visit to Israel and Saudi Arabia, and it didn't happen. I mean, if anything happened, it happened behind closed doors, and we will learn about it maybe at some point in the future. But on a public level, the Iranian narrative was this is to sort of give diplomatic support to partners, in this case, Israel and the Gulf Arab states. But by and large, the Iranians didn't think it would result in anything groundbreaking as far as mobilizing the region against Iran is concerned. And I would say, by and large, they were right. The Iranian narrative was not wrong. I don't see any signs of a major, new mobilization being led by the United States of partners in that part of the world against Iran. In fact, the Saudis were pretty quick to come out and say that just because President Biden was allowed to come in from Israel using Saudi airspace doesn't mean that, Saudi Arabia is going to recognize Israel. The Emiratis said they're not interested in the anti-Iran coalition. So I think, that Iranian reading seems to have dominated. Although I have to say, there was a moment a few days before President Biden arrived in the region where I sensed an Iranian moment of panic when there was a lot of reports about a solid American effort to create this integrated anti-air defense system across the region to deal with the threat of Iranian missiles and drones. That got Iran's attention. That was the only time where the Iranians really came back and hit hard and were warning neighboring states that if you take such actions against us, we will retaliate in kind. But again, that disappeared as soon as Biden had left Saudi Arabia. So perhaps the Iranians don't think much will come on that front either. So overall, I would say, there was no sign of this Biden visit having created any new kind of long-term strategic concerns for the Iranians.
The other recent development of note was Russian President Vladimir Putin's trip to Iran, meeting with Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and joining a trilateral summit with Raisi and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Putin's trip seemed very much like a sort of response to Biden's. What were your key takeaways from that, and how did it kind of contrast the two different visits?
I mean, number one is Vladimir Putin is not welcome in most parts of the world. So, there are a few friendly territories he can travel to and play the role of a statesman. And Iran is, with Ayatollah Khamenei as the supreme leader, is friendly territory for President Putin. Putin and Khamenei have known each other pretty much for about 22 years. There's been a lot of personal investment in this relationship. I believe this was Putin's 5th visit to Iran. So, it's a relationship that has been nurtured for some time. But let's not kid ourselves. What keeps these two countries together more than anything else is that common opposition to a U.S. agenda in the Middle East, or what they would consider American hegemonic aspirations of the global stage. So that's really what brings someone like Putin to Tehran. Now, I know there were announcements of in one case, $40 billion worth of investments by Russia in the Iranian energy sector. Frankly, Russia does not have $40 billion to invest right now in the Iranian energy sector. So there was a lot of, talk of how this was a groundbreaking moment in relations. I would take a step back and say the reason why Putin there probably actually didn't have much to do with Biden. I think this was more of a coincidence. I think this was on the cards for some time. I suspect Iran and Russia wanted to talk to President Erdogan of Turkey about Turkish plans to invade Syria. So this is something that's been brewing for weeks and months now. I think that was more the reason than sort of a quick Putin reaction to Biden's visit to Israel and Saudi Arabia. And the other thing I have to say, if the Iranians still harbor this illusion that Russia can come in and pick Iran's side against everybody else that presumably will be in the American side, then I think that's fundamentally a misreading of where the region is today. The black and white that Ayatollah Khamenei wants to see of pro-US, pro-Russia camp doesn't really exist in the Middle East, except in the case of Iran, where Khamenei's foreign policy has isolated Iran so much so he has no option but to turn to Russia and China. And so that's Iran's loss. That's not the region's loss. I think the region overall is better. Countries like UAE, Turkey, even Saudi Arabia, they're doing much better in terms of balancing their foreign policy, maximizing benefits for the national interest. Unfortunately for Iran or the Iranian population, Ayatollah Khamenei doesn't really think in terms of national interest so much as he thinks in terms of loyalty to an individual, in this case Putin, who he thinks he can bank on in keeping the Islamic Republic afloat and keeping himself in the position of supreme leader as long as he can.
Alex, before we wrap up, any final thoughts?
Look, I mean, in terms of Putin's visit to Tehran, there will be plenty of talk of, again, this being strategic. I just want to remind everyone, we've been here before. We've talked plenty about this strategic relationship between Iran and Russia. If you just look at some hard facts, take Iran's ability to help Russia in the Ukraine war, even if Khamenei wanted to help Russia militarily in Ukraine. And, there are some suggestions with the reports of Iran selling drones to Russia that there might be some Iranian involvement militarily. But let's not forget, Iranian public opinion overwhelmingly is suspicious of Russia, is overwhelmingly against the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and is overwhelmingly against how Khamenei has essentially made Iran into a client state of sorts, or at least beholden to Putin's goodwill. These are the hard facts. So the space for Khamenei to do what he wants vis-a-vis Russia is actually limited, not because he has put limitations on it himself, but because Iranian public opinion demands it. So I think, that to me suggests one simple thing, that President Putin's visit was symbolically positive for Iran. It gives the impression that Iran is this, center for diplomacy right now. But in the long term, you have to ask the question, what will keep these two countries together diplomatically, economically, in terms of ideology? I mean, we're talking about a Shia Islamist regime in Tehran and Vladimir Putin's Russia, which is, whatever it is, it's certainly not Shia Islamist. There are rivals in the oil and gas markets and so forth, and nor do they see eye to eye on key issues. Russia has relations with Israel, Iran's regional nemesis. So there are lots of things that will also divide them. The one thing that keeps them together for now is their joint, and as I said, position against the United States and U.S., what they call hegemonic aspirations. But you have to wonder if that's enough to make Iran-Russia relations that much deeper than they are to this at the moment. I think what you definitely do have is, and this is unfortunate for the Iranian national interest, you have a leadership in Tehran that is willing to pay a very high price to keep Vladimir Putin satisfied. But how long that can go on for, given the state of the Iranian economy, is a really open question that, I'm not just wondering about it. I'm sure the leadership in Tehran, including folks like Khamenei and the generals and the Revolutionary Guards, also need to think about.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but thank you very much for joining the program, Alex.
Thank you, Alistair.
That's all the time we have for this week. I want to thank all of the guests on today's program, as well as our listeners for tuning in, and our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.